Dr. Saracino is an assistant professor of art history at the University of Arizona. She received her joint PhD in art history and Latin American studies from Tulane University. Her research focuses on indigenous cartographic traditions of central Mexico, cross-cultural interactions between mendicant friars and indigenous communities, and the impact of these exchanges on the visual culture of early colonial Mexico. Her works also investigate Nahua relationships to the natural and built environment as reflected in the visual culture of early colonial Mexico. Her work has appeared in the journals of Magamundi, Art Bulletin, as well as, or is that Artless Bulletin? Artless, yeah. I wasn't sure if that was just a quirky typo, you know, that the at symbol got it. So it's Artless. I love the play on words. Artless Bulletin, not Artless. Artless as in atlas. Her work has appeared in the journal. Oh, I'm sorry, I read that already. And the forthcoming, she also contributed to the volume that I co-edited with Kathy Brosnan, Mapping Nature Across the Americas, which was published in by the University of Chicago in 2020. And the forthcoming Collective Creativity and Artistic Agency in Colonial Latin America, which is published by the University of Florida Press in 2022. Her current book project focuses on Uppsala map of Mexico. I like to say that because the Swedes told me how to pronounce it properly. The Uppsala map of Mexico Tenochtitlan, the earliest known map of Mexico City, painted by indigenous artists after Spanish conquest. She's also a past participant, I'm happy to say, and I think she's going to mention this, in one of our NEH Summer Institutes, one of several people that have had this connection. And she will be, some of the work that's represented today started during her research in that Summer Institute. So she's going to be talking about the Ayer map of Teotihuacan as embodied action and performance. And by the way, this is the map you've been seeing as kind of the logo for this conference. We'll turn this over to Jen.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. First, I want to begin by thanking Jim Ackerman for the invitation to participate in this weekend's Nebenzahl lectures, and the Newberry Library for all of their support throughout my career. I first met Jim, as he said, as part of an NEH-sponsored seminar hosted here at the Newberry Library in 2014 when I was a graduate student, and it forever changed the way I approach maps. I had a subsequent fellowship at the Newberry, and my approach, my scholarship, and really my burgeoning career would truly not be possible without the ongoing support of Jim, the Herman Dunlap Smith Center of Cartography, and the Newberry Library. So thank you so much for the extraordinary opportunities you have provided and continue to provide me. Before I begin my presentation, I would like to acknowledge that my research centers on the artistic productions and cultural traditions of the Nahua, and I approach this as a non-native researcher and outsider. I am presenting my own interpretations of this material based on my research, and I aim to do so from a place of utmost respect and appreciation. In the Newberry Library's Ayer collection, a map of Teotihuacan, an archaeological site about 30 miles northeast of present-day Mexico City, depicts the boundaries between the properties of 3 indigenous Nahua proprietors. The map shows the men standing in different areas of the site, separated by bold black lines that differentiate property boundaries. An added handwritten note on the map indicates that it was created circa 1560, although scholars believe this date was added much later, a point I'll return to. Remarkably, the map also shows us the ruins of the pre-Hispanic city of Teotihuacan, mysteriously abandoned circa 650 CE, about 500 years before the Mexica people established the Aztec Empire in the Central Valley of Mexico. Today, Teotihuacan is one of the most famous archaeological sites within Mesoamerica, a broad cultural region that encompasses indigenous, pre-Hispanic cultures ranging roughly from the U.S. Southwest through Central America. And now I'm going to do my slide on terminology. So widely known as the Aztecs, the indigenous group that headed the Triple Alliance Empire at the time of Spanish conquest actually called themselves the Mexica. And so here, this moniker that many of you might know actually comes from 18th century scholars, and it comes from the kind of semi-legendary origin place of the Mexica that they called Aztlan. So that's where the term Aztec came from. But they called themselves the Mexica, and the capital of the Aztec Empire was Tenochtitlan, which is today modern Mexico City. So after Spanish forces toppled the empire, the indigenous population of central Mexico became known as the Nahua, after the most widely spoken language of the region, Nahuatl. And so that's the term I'll be using to refer to the indigenous people depicted in the map. The Mexica venerated the ruins of Teotihuacan as an ancestral origin site. So on this map, you can see this red circle. So Tenochtitlan is here, and you can see Teotihuacan a little bit north. So the Mexica believed that life on Earth occurred in 5 successive ages, each heralded by the creation of a separate sun. The 5th and present age in which we currently live began at Teotihuacan, where the deities Tecusistecat and Nanahuatzin threw themselves into a great fire to become the sun and the moon. The 2 great pyramids of Teotihuacan, the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon, were both named for these deities, and the map makers included both pyramids in the depiction of the site. They also included the site's 3-mile-long road, known as the Avenue of the Dead, that bisects the city from north to south. So you see these double parallel lines here. The ruins of Teotihuacan border the western edge of the map, which is oriented with east at the top. At its southern end, the viewer's right, the road terminates in a large red circle emanating with black wavy lines. This shape marks the Ciudadela and the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. In addition to the site's monumental pre-Hispanic architecture, the image also includes the San Juan River, 2 parallel black lines shaded with blue pigment, dividing the entire composition diagonally from left to right, or northeast to southwest. At one point, there were at least 3 known copies of this map. The American Museum of Natural History in New York holds the Saville copy. The Newberry Library possesses this one. And a 3rd iteration, now lost, contained the most detailed and might have been an 18th or 19th century copy of the original missing source. The visually distinctive maps combine European and indigenous cartographic conventions. The lines marking boundaries and rivers would have been legible to Spanish authorities, but other elements, such as the footprints to symbolize roads or pathways, which you can see here, and other pictographic symbols that appear in various places throughout the map, would have been less clear to Spanish audiences. But the added Nahuatl glosses help clarify these features. The maps were likely created by indigenous litigants who sought to prove the legitimacy of the proprietary rights to local lands. In the colonial period, Spanish authorities accepted indigenous-made maps and painted manuscripts as legal evidence in court cases. Often, Spanish administrators asked native witnesses to elaborate orally on the content of these documents for the court. Notably, in indigenous cultural tradition, community elders and sages interpreted and read aloud the content of pictorial manuscripts for the larger community. Elsewhere, in the volume that Jim mentioned, I've written about how the map's shifting status from a legal document in a community cabildo to its present location in the Newberry Library signaled a loss in its potency as a legal document and paralleled the expropriation of indigenous lands by the national government. However, something I was not able to attend to was the fact that the creation of the map itself was a product of social processes and performances enacted by a network of both collaborative and contentious dynamics among Nahua and Spaniards. In addition, this map was a living document, copied and reused multiple times throughout Mexico's 300-plus-year colonial period. In my presentation today, I aim to elaborate upon the map's performative context to foreground the role of the Nahua communities that used and created these maps, and to restore the agency of the map itself as an indigenous-made document. By recontextualizing the Ayer map as part of a scenario, a concept coined by performance theorist Diana Taylor, I propose to review the ways in which the map is a product of and a prescription for gestures and actions that are emblematic of larger social processes. And we heard a little bit about Diana Taylor's work in Ernesto's presentation first today. In her book, The Archive and the Repertoire, Taylor identifies a rift in historical knowledge between the, quote, archive of supposedly enduring materials, that is texts and documents, and the so-called ephemeral repertoire of embodied practice/knowledge, that is spoken language, dance, and ritual. In my presentation, I want to focus on the repertoire embodied in the map of Teotihuacan to highlight the actions of the indigenous makers who continually wielded this map as a tool of negotiation throughout New Spain's colonial period. In addition, I also want to offer an alternative conceptualization for this object as a map. I contend it's partially in our calling of this document a map, with all its historical implications, that has diminished the potency of it as an active object, used in conjunction with a constellation of indigenous and Spanish actors meant to be wielded as part of a performance and enunciated as a script. In the remainder of my presentation, I will discuss the various stages of performance encapsulated within this map's life. Act 1, the production of indigenous maps as a scenario. In this part of my presentation, I want to provide an overview of the elaborate process enacted to create this map. And the story begins with the culmination of the Spanish conquest in 1521. Indigenous-made maps proliferated in the early colonial period, due largely to the crisis of land tenure brought upon by the invasion of Spanish conquistadors and colonizers. After conquest, the crown initially rewarded Spanish conquistadors with tracts of land, as well as entitlements of indigenous labor. This was known as the encomienda system, for their service to the crown, or in exchange for their service to the crown. Throughout the first audiencia, and this is the court, the first official court and governing body of the Spanish crown, the conquistadors exploited the system, overworking and overtaxing the indigenous population and greedily usurping territories beyond their legal rights. After his arrival in 1535, Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza instituted a new land grant system with strict regulations to mitigate the socio-political disorder wreaked by the activities of the first audiencia. In the new Merced system, Mendoza granted plots of land through a standardized process. In this system, indigenous people were eligible to seek land grants to confirm their existing rights to land or to receive permission to raise livestock. So, how did this process work? The Viceroy implemented strict regulations for the process of requesting mercedes, and it's this entire process that I would like to frame as the first performance, or scenario, culminating in the creation of the map itself. First, the audiencia issued an acordado, that is, a written record of the grant. Then, the local corregidor, or alcalde mayor, types of government officials in charge of the area under request, sent this acordado to its designated recipients. It was the responsibility of the local official to ensure that the grant did not encroach on lands already owned by either natives or Spaniards. As part of this act, the official announced the site and size of the grant to the local population and collected testimony about the status of the lands to be granted. And one aspect of this I didn't add in this little flow chart was when the acordado was reviewed by the official and the claimants would go out to the parcel of land in question together. They would conduct vista de ojos, or these literal land surveys. They'd walk the boundaries. So it was very much a physical act of kind of inspecting the lands to be granted. And finally, this all would culminate in the pintura, which was a final testament to the requested land's availability for Merced. So the litigants were charged with creating a map as part of this process. And the acordados clearly stipulated features that the pinturas should depict. So they should show things like settlements and fields and demonstrate that the lands were the legally mandated distance away from other fields and ranches. The entire Mercedes proceeding, then, can be read, to use Taylor's term, as a, quote, embodied culture for transmission, end quote. And the maps that were produced because of these proceedings might be better thought of as, quote, transmitting knowledge of ritualized movement and everyday social practices, end quote. The map is thus a record of actions taken and emblematic of larger social processes enacted continually throughout several centuries. As I mentioned earlier, a gloss in the upper left portion of the map reads 1560, indicating its date of production. However, George Kubler has argued that the three known versions of the map are copies of a lost original and hypothesized that they might have been made in the early 17th century or 1600s. A more recent analysis by Michelle Odijk and Leonardo Lopez Lujan date this particular Newberry map to sometime between 1700 and 1767, when it was last documented as evidence in a legal case. Many indigenous-made maps of the colonial period were deliberately archaized or made to look older as a strategy to legitimate territorial claims. The older a map appeared, then the longer it seemed the indigenous litigant held claim to the territory in question. It's interesting to note, though, that the map may have been made in the late 1500s or early 1600s, but was reconsulted in a documented court case in the 1700s. Thus, the map was an active and continual agent in colonial land disputes, and its repeated consultation was part of the scenario of land dispute and litigation in colonial Teotihuacan. So one of the ways the map was archaized was through the depiction of the indigenous landowners themselves. And I'll point them out. They're here, and then in the Newberry copy, unfortunately, this figure is gone, is lost to time. And this map is on a backing, just to give you a sense of what we're looking at. And this is a mate paper. So in the map, the Nawa proprietors all carry pre-Hispanic weapons. Don Diego Mazateutli holds a staff with serrated obsidian blades, and Don Hipólito Mizquiteutli grips a circular shield. These accessories are typical of pre-colonial indigenous warriors, often associated with the Mexica's ancestral Chichimec lineage. All the men wear the signature hairstyle of noble Mexica warriors, hair half up and fastened with a red tie in a manner like that of the men depicted on the first page of the Codex Mendoza. And this document was made in circa 1540. In her discussion of indigenous colonial documents, Stephanie Wood has highlighted how artist mapmakers added portraits of specific archetypal indigenous figures to highlight their ancestral relation to pre-Hispanic elites, subtly communicating that they merited the land because of their illustrious lineage. However, in the final part of my presentation, I want to highlight another function of these depicted indigenous landowners, and that is the role of these figures as denotations for an enacted and reoccurring performance. Act 2, the Ayer map of Teotihuacan as scripted performance. So to understand this map as a scripted performance, I'll review the circumstances of its production and then outline the features of it that can be understood as a script. As I've mentioned, Leonardo Lopez Lujan and Michelle Odijk have established that this map seems to have been made in response to a land dispute. The map's imagery and written Nahuatl text indicate that at this point in the 16th century, these lands had been divided among three indigenous landowners. The three individuals whose properties and their respective boundaries are the subject of the map are depicted in three-quarter profile. The glosses identify them as Don Diego Mazateutli in the upper left within a red square, Don Juan Cuitla Mis Teutli directly across from him, and Don Hipólito Miski Teutli in the lower right-hand corner. So bold black lines delineate the divisions among their properties, and Lopez, Lujan, and Odijk have suggested that it may have been the shifting political status of neighboring barrios and pueblos that might have been the cause of all of this litigation. After conquest, Spanish authorities restructured the political and economic organization of New Spain to control the indigenous population. An essential aspect of this process was the implementation of the Spanish cabecera. A cabecera was the secular ecclesiastical capital of a district in Castile, Spain. In New Spain, the Spanish name for viceregal Mexico, the jurisdiction of the cabeceras constituted smaller pueblos, or sujetos, that were further divided into barrios. Lopez, Lujan, and Odijk have hypothesized that the dispute arose between the communities of San Martin Obispo and San Juan Teotihuacan over the boundaries of two of San Juan Teotihuacan's barrios, Purificación and Coatlan, when the political status of these neighboring communities changed in the 18th century. So before 1740, according to documents in the Archivo General de la Nación, San Martin was formerly a subject of San Juan Teotihuacan, as you can see, as I tried to make clear here. Then 4 years later, San Martin's status elevated to that of a pueblo, so then they become equal in status. And then these communities entered into a dispute over the boundaries between them. From the outset of corregimiento, that is the Spanish reorganization of indigenous communities, neighboring sujetos commonly disputed boundaries. Rarely ever, as we can imagine, were the names of barrios pertaining to each sujeto documented, and thus disputes frequently arose. Adding to the confusion was the fact that the cabecera sujeto system became largely obsolete due to death from disease, and indigenous communities were repeatedly restructured throughout the 16th and 17th century, as appears to have happened at San Juan Teotihuacan. Thus, old maps and copies of old maps were of increasing importance in new land disputes, as evidence in court. I'd now like to shift our attention back to some of the formal elements of the map and guide us through an analysis of the relationship between the depicted landowners, their boundary lines, and the text added to the Amate paper, and how these elements can all be read as part of the larger scenario in which the map was used. That is, the gestures and actions emblematic of larger social processes. A feature shared by many indigenous maps made in the late viceregal period was the inclusion of these individuals wearing ancestral pre-Hispanic dress. The figure in the lower left-hand corner wears a tilmatli, a type of cloak that denoted a male's elevated or noble status. This depicted figure functions in what some scholars have termed as deictic. In language, a deictic word is referential and dependent on context and speaker. So these are words spoken to facilitate a temporary or spatial connection between the speaker and reader. So words such as here, there, now. So this is completely dependent on the relationship between you and I in this room right now. For scholar Tom Cummins, the Aztec oral tradition implicated the speaker and listener through spatio-temporal references, what he refers to as deictic expressions. And in the case of indigenous maps from central Mexico, these deictic expressions in pictorial narrative became a phenomenological experience. So in the Ayer map, this figure is functioning in a deictic manner. He points, and if you can see that, he has his index finger pointing towards the boundary, just beyond himself, for us, the viewers. His embodied presence and his pointing finger highlight what is noteworthy within this representation. His presence marks that he was once there in space and time at the origin of demarcating these boundaries. However, he crosses time and space by continuing to occupy the space on this map, reappearing for the viewer and the reader every time the map is reconsulted. We can see this at work in the Ayer map, not only in the figure of Don Juan Cuitlamisteyutli in the lower left-hand corner, but also with the inclusion of specific glosses that include deictic expressions. For example, the first gloss underneath the church reads, Iska in Tlapowali Xiwit de 1560 años, which translates to, here is the count of the years, the year 1560. The deictic expression in this phrase is the Nahuatl word iska, meaning here, signaling an utterance that is denoting a location on the page and thus implicating both the listener and the speaker in the reading and enunciation of the document. Similarly, by the boundaries shared between San Francisco Mazapan and San Pedro, a gloss reads Nican Tlami San Pedro Tlali, meaning here end the lands of San Pedro. In this case, Nican translates to here, again indicating an association made between the reader, listener, interlocutor, and document. As Jessica Ster has pointed out, viceregal officials enforced land title verification through a policy called composición. In this process, indigenous leaders were routinely asked to present their pinturas to verify boundaries and for surveyors to use as guides. Interestingly, she argues, in these types of pictorial documents, a contextual shift in the deictic field occurs. The addresser, with the word here, or nikan, is referring to the physical time and space that the addressee inherits, the reading of the manuscript. However, the addresser is alluding to past moments of time and space in which the boundaries were initially demarcated. Thus, there is an ongoing transspatial and transtemporal element built into this document through text and iconography. Another notable aspect of the map's iconography are the inclusion of footprints that I mentioned earlier. As Barbara Mundy has discussed, the inclusion of footprints, a distinctly pre-Hispanic indigenous pictorial convention, probably emphasized that the map was a permanent record of an evanescent ritual of boundary walking. And this is another way that the indigenous Nahua would denote territorial claims, was through a ceremonial walking of that property in question. In my presentation today, I wanted to shift our notion of this map as an archival document and instead emphasize how it functioned as part of a broader repertoire of embodied practice and knowledge, invoking Diana Taylor's ideas. A complex network of actors and social processes led to the creation of this map, as I described in Act 1. And in Act 2, I wanted to highlight how certain iconographic features, the allusions to the Nahua's ancestral lineage and the deictic pointing of the figure, coupled with the Nahuatl word nikan, meaning here, implicated the viewer and the reader or listener. This Teotihuacan map, in its very reading, is both a record of and continuing script for embodied action. Every time it is consulted, every time we cast our gaze upon Don Diego Cuitlamisteyutli and his neighbors, we are brought through time and space, from now into the past, the very moment when the original community participated in the vistas de ojo and the ritualistic walking of the boundaries, denoted by the footprints that once and still traverse this landscape. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jen. I should have said at the outset that sitting in front of me at the front row is Will Hansen, our currently the director of collection of reader services at the Newberry Library and our curator of Americana. He's been here for 12 years, and when the time comes, he'll be moderating the questions. I'm pleased to introduce two more speakers who'll be working together, as happened in the first session. First of all, George Ironstrack, who has participated in the Miami language renewal projects as both a student and a teacher since the mid-1990s, Originally from Chicago, George and his family now make their home in Oxford, Ohio. George is a citizen of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma and has assisted in the organization and administration of the tribe's Aacimwahkionkonci, I hope I got that right, or close, summer educational experience since its inception in 2005. George received an MA in Origins and History of the United States from the Department of History of Miami University. His graduate work centered on Miami village of Pickawillani, which was located in western Ohio, near the city of Piqua. George continues to regularly research and write about Miami history. Examples of his work can be found on the Miami community blog, which I'll let you Google for the URL. As both a tribal educator and a former public school teacher, George is also interested in the study of indigenous pedagogical practices and the ongoing development of Miami. Well, I should have asked them how to pronounce these things before I did. Teotihuacan, Miami education, and George, feel free to correct me profusely, as will be needed. Cam Shriver specializes in early American and Native American history. As a community-engaged scholar, he focuses on research and teaching in support of tribal revitalization efforts and works at the Miami Center at Miami University. His long-standing project documenting Miami leadership, he has a long-standing project documenting Miami leadership, but other research has included the development of empires in the colonial Great Lakes, as well as explaining the relationship between Indian country and academia. The title of the talk is yet another one that's a tongue twister for me personally, and maybe I'll let George pronounce it when he comes up. But after the colon is Stories from the Land. Please welcome George and then Cam.
Newe Jim, newe cheke, yowe cheke piako, nehe Aacimwahkionkonci. Newe to Jim and the staff of the Newberry for inviting Cam and I to come and speak today, and Newe for doing your best to pronounce Aacimwahkionkonci, our language. The night of March 10, 1897, found my great-uncle, George Ironstrack, fast asleep in a chair in the Corn Palace, a saloon located at the corner of Franklin and Madison Streets here in Chicago. The Corn Palace was owned by Dick's younger brother, James. Dick, or Aacimwahkionkonci, as he was known in Aacimwahkionkonci, the Miami Indian language, was there that night serving as watchman because the Corn Palace had been regularly robbed. Shortly after midnight, Dick was startled awake by the bark of his dog, and as a figure moved towards him in the dark, he fired 2 shots from his pistol, hitting the intruder, a man named Louis Lenger. Dick fired another shot that missed as Lenger fled out the window. About an hour later, Lenger was found dead, and Dick was arrested and taken into custody. The Chicago Daily Tribune reported a series of articles on the shooting and the subsequent trial. In these articles, the Corn Palace's owner, James Strack, was identified by the nickname Indian Jim. There's a photo of Aacimwahkionkonci at the family saloon in Fort Wayne, and then here's his brother, Owansapia, or Jim, on the right. The Tribune also reported that Louis Lenger was found with multiple objects in his possession that proved he had robbed the saloon on previous occasions. The jury quickly exonerated Dick from legal responsibility in Lenger's death. Note that none of these articles, despite mentioning that James's nickname was Indian Jim, none of the articles mentioned James or Dick's tribal affiliations as Miami or Miami Indians. So here's a little bit of the geography here. The Corn Palace is marked with a blue star, and Jim also tended bar at Berghoff's, eventually when it opened Berghoff's Cafe, and at Burger's Saloon, another saloon called the White Palace in town. I've also mapped his home in 1910 here in Chicago, and the Guardian Angel Mission in Old Village that I'll talk about in just a second. Back in the place of James and Dick's birth, Kihkayonge, or Fort Wayne, Indiana, local newspapers also picked up the story. Reporting on March 12th, the Fort Wayne News described Dick as, quote, a Fort Wayne boy born on the Godfrey Reserve, end quote, on the southwest side of Fort Wayne. The report mentioned that Dick had been back in Fort Wayne to visit his family reserve just 1 week before the shooting. The Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette, reporting on the same day, mentioned that a third brother, Charles, my great-grandfather, ran a saloon on the Godfrey Reserve. As a racist aside, the Journal-Gazette article also reported, quote, the boys all have Indian blood in their veins, but have a reputation as peaceable men, end quote. When I first read this tragic story, a few elements struck a deep chord within me. First, my Miami Indian family was not hiding in plain sight. Everywhere they went, they were noted as Indian, or specifically as Miami. Second, in the 1890s, for my family, there was a continual rapid movement between Kihkayonge, Fort Wayne, and Shikakonge, Chicago. Third, saloons and the sale of alcohol were central to my family's business endeavors in Kihkayonge and Shikakonge. This added a challenging layer to my understanding of the impact of alcohol on Miami people. Normally we're portrayed as the victims of alcohol and alcoholism, rather than someone who might be sort of the purveyor or the perpetrator of it. But the newspaper accounts also left me with many unanswered questions. Why did my great-uncles relocate to Shikakonge? Shikakonge, Chicago, is an intergenerationally Miami place. We've been coming here since time out of mind. And a place important to the lives and stories of many indigenous nations, right? We don't claim it as an exclusive part of our territory. For example, one of the 3 French dictionaries that we use in our language revitalization work was composed, at least in part, at the Guardian Angel Mission located within a Miami-speaking village in Shikakonge in the late 1690s. But it would be a huge stretch to argue that my great-uncles made the move to Shikakonge because of those connections. So why did they leave our family's Kihkayonge Reserve? These were lands our Miami ancestors had called home since time out of mind. As we will see today, my family's story of movement back and forth between Kihkayonge and Shikakonge is unsurprisingly complicated. It involves the legacies of treaties, forced removals, the diminishment of legal rights, and the loss of land. My great-grandfather, Kihkandanga, or Charles, all of his siblings, and my grandfather were all born on our family's treaty reserve land in what is today Fort Wayne. For most of its legal history, this reserve was known as the Richardville Reserve. The name comes from the original caretaker of the reserve, my 7th great-grandfather, Penjoa, Jean-Baptiste Richardville. For a time, it was also known as the Godfrey Reserve, like in the articles around the time of the shooting, as Miami intermarriage led to changes in surnames on the reserve. In my family, we know that eventually all the reserve lands were lost to us. Many found new homes in the greater Kihkayonge, Fort Wayne area, and others relocated farther away to places like Shikakonge, Chicago. But how, we often ask, how exactly was our reserve land lost? It is clear to us that some part of the family wanted to continue living on the reserve. So why were they not able to do so? As researchers and educators, a challenge that my colleague Cameron Shriver and I face is how to contextualize these family-specific granular stories within the broader history of Miami people, which includes all of Miami lands, and to present intelligible and meaning responses to the question, what happened to the Miami Nation's land? I just want to make sure we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about it today, but much of the work that we're going to talk about in terms of mapping, which comes off of surveying practices pretty neatly from earlier today, happens on a landscape that's deeply cultural. And we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the cultural landscape today, but I want to make sure that I situate Shikakonge, Chicago, and Kihkayonge, Fort Wayne, within this cultural landscape defined by our place names, right? Not an exclusive nation state, a shared land base, but this is the land that Miami people lived on and the land that reflects our language. We have names for the places here, and there is a logic and a wisdom and a thinking that informs knowledge of the land. It's not empty space, it's not wilderness, it's not unknown, but it's known to a specific group of people in a specific way.
Topical. My name is Cam Shriver. I work down the hall from George at Miami University, and I'm an American and a historian, so Aacimwahkionkonci. Thanks for coming. Aacimwahkionkonci is what I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes. Aacimwahkionkonci, which means stories from the land in Miami-Atawangi, the Miami language. That's our goal, okay, to revitalize people's connections with their lands and with each other. But an obvious question then is, why is that necessary to begin with? Well, the easy answer, the quick answer, is that for the last 2 centuries, Miami tribe and its citizens and families have been undergoing about 200 years of fracturing from their heritage landscapes. The most obvious of these processes is the forced deportations, first in 1846, to Kansas territory, from what is now Indiana to what is now Kansas. And from there, the tribe again was forced to move to Indian territory in the 1870s and 80s and 90s. So in both Kansas and Indian territories, the people privatized or allotted their shared reservations. In Kansas, there are 3 rounds of allotment, which parcels out or privatizes the reservation to exactly 300 individuals within the Miami Nation. That's on the left. So you can see Kansas City, the state line with Missouri, and the Miami Reservation, which is Lynn County and Miami County in Kansas today. And on the right, you can see the Oklahoma Reservation. Again, the northeast corner of Oklahoma. I'm also shaky, Jim. That's why I got kicked out of surgeon school, I guess. Kansas and Missouri, so the far northeast corner of Oklahoma, where a lot of the nations from this region were deported to. In Oklahoma, they share a reservation with the Peoria Nation, and in 1892, the tribe allotted, again, exactly 100 parcels to 66 individuals, then citizens of the tribe. The Miami tribe has begun the arduous process of reclaiming some of these trust lands since the 1970s, but it's worth noting that from the 19-teens to the 1970s, the Miami Nation owned no land as a nation. Today, Miami citizens live internationally and in 49 different states, so this is a nation in diaspora all over the place. So the Miami tribe of Oklahoma is the community that we're primarily talking about, based in Oklahoma today. But nonetheless, we're going to return back to the Midwest. Although the Miami Nation and most of its citizens moved west, in 1846, several large families remained in Indiana, never left. And many continued moving back and forth between the reservations in the west and the family lands back in Indiana. Here we can see not only territories that are relinquished by the tribe, as well as one unceded territory that is expressly granted to the tribe. So these large shapes are treaty cessions, relinquished by the nation to the United States federal government in treaties. But the other color, the other polygons, the other shapes, are equally as important to this story, which are reserves and allotments that are retained by Miami families and individuals, both before and after the nation's removal. This is one of those reserves today. Now it's the city of Lafayette, Indiana. But for over a century, it was the land owned by the Longlois family, specifically. This is another map of that same land. In the National Archives, it's reserve number 45. Specifically, these are disputes about the land, written back and forth from Tippecanoe County officials, Miami families, owners of the land, the Longlois, and county officials, sheriffs, the President of the United States. So it's granted to the children of Longlois in 1818 in a treaty. These are written back and forth from Tippecanoe County to Washington, D.C. So the federal government oversaw the ownership of over 100 Miami reserves just in Indiana and Ohio, not to mention 300 in Kansas and 100 in Indian Territory. This is that same land, or a piece of it, in our research database, the Aacimwahkionkonci research database. The vast majority of what we do, what I do as a researcher, is try to piece together a really convoluted, difficult, disparate paper trail. Mainly not maps, mainly prose, writing about land, The Long Glory Reserve, so in essence, our first step was to map all of the allotments of Miamia people. In other words, there's one story of American history, which is Native Americans lose their land. There's an equally important, I'm not disputing that, there's an equally important story of Indigenous people owning land and keeping it and doing things with it and living on it. So this is part of that story. We wanted to map all the allotments of Miamia people. And this is essentially that map. Many years have gone into this image. Let's think about kind of what that takes. This is the Long Glory Reserve in the context of Miamia lands. So the cessions being ceded beginning in 1795 with the Treaty of Greenville. The claim of Mishkinakwa, Little Turtle, in 1795 is this color. Both George and I are colorblind, so this is a problem for when we get up and say, the color, it's this color, it's this thing. And he says, the Miami Nation has always been here. My forefathers kindled the first fire at Aacimwahkionkonci, Detroit. From thence they extended their line down the Scioto River to the Ohio River, which you would have called Kansan-Sipiwi. From thence down to the mouth of the Wapashiki-Sipiwi, the Wabash River, from thence to Shikakonge. This is the land of the Miami Nation. So we've mapped that, as well as the little pieces that are continue to be owned by Miami people. Now, as you can tell, the pop-ups that come up in the system is not that this is the Long Glory Reserve, here's what it looks like, here's how people lived on it. Instead, it's very basic, R0140000. So I'm trying to highlight, I guess, in distinction to George's story, the violence of abstraction that is going into colonialism, and even how we represent that process in the back end. This is how it splits over about 120 years as people bequeath the land to their children. They often have more than one, therefore it has to be split. They're selling it acre by acre over 40 different parcels over 120 years. Let's look at another example, more to the point, today. George's family land. We want to focus really on the current capabilities of our database, which is Aacimwahkionkonci, as well as its limits, its very real limits. If I search for Pinjua in our system, eventually I'll get to, there are many Pinjuas who are Miamia, but I want to look at this guy, Jean-Baptiste Richardville, whose Miamia name is Pinjua. Pinjua, or Jean-Baptiste Richardville, was the first national Aacima of the Miamis as a unified nation. So we're attempting to record some basic information about every landowner who's Miamia, who owned some of these original lands as part of the allotment process. So again, that's about 500 initial, like step one is 500 people. If we scroll down on the same page, we'll see all of Richardville's land. So we can see all of the land that he acquired through the treaty process between 1818 and 1840. It's quite a portfolio, actually, of land. It's important to remember that his nation had, in his lifetime, relinquished most of the areas shown on the map, but nonetheless, he reserved these allotments, typically in 1 square mile reserves. Today, we're going to focus on just one, south of Fort Wayne, south of Kikeonge, the very land that George began with. Highlighted here. Another way of thinking about his land is that it's in the context not only of land loss, but of other Miamia people who are owning land all around him. These are individuals, families, and nations. We see here reserves retained in the treaties signed between 1818 and 1840, and some are individual reserves, like Jean-Baptiste Richardville's reserve on the west side of the Nalmewa-Sipiwi. Highlighted, this is the reserve we're going to talk about. Others are village or family reserves, like Amekwa's Reserve, Beaver's Reserve, or White Raccoon, Wapasipana's Reserve. And others, pictured here, like the 10 Mile Reserve, are national reserves retained by the Miami Nation as a community. By the time of removal, if we had activated the time slider on this map, it seems that only Wapasipana La Fontaine Reserve and the Richardville Reserve on the west side is still owned by the Miami people. So by the time of removal, Wapasipana La Fontaine's reserve is still owned. Jean-Baptiste Richardville, his reserve is still owned, but the rest have been sold to non-Miamia settlers. And most of the Miamia people have moved to the south and west towards Huntington, Indiana, Peru, Indiana, the Mishingwa Reserve towards Marion, Indiana, to the south and west, moving away from this area a bit. Aside from a few U.S. reserve lands, Miami folks could actually choose what lands they wanted to retain. These were the first surveys in this region, surveyed before the public land survey system. So they're all at different angles, actually not on the grid system. Here I've shown important village and cultural places as well as key rivers to give us a sense of why did Miami people choose this land to reserve. It's a useful overlay, hopefully. If we overlay those reserves that are claimed by Miami people, it seems obvious enough that people retained allotments along the Wabash River, clearly, encompassing some key villages, probably some hunting grounds, including the Godfrey Reserve out here, a few potential development sites like Muncie, Indiana, some portage sites, future development sites even. Okay. Let's zoom into thinking about Jean-Baptiste Richardville. He acquired a reserve of 3 square miles as part of the negotiations at the Treaty of 1818. And he was one of about 23 individuals, depending on how you count, to be granted lands in this case during this negotiation. Now, the specific location was where he lived actually at that time. So this is his primary residence. This is an important guy. The chief of the nation, between 1818 and his death in 1840. This is where he lives. He was near his childhood community at Kikeonge, which had been taken by the United States and renamed as Fort Wayne, a real performance of mapping, to just fundamentally rename a place after the conquering general, famously Mad Anthony Wayne. He probably retained a portage on the Continental Divide. This is a very important spot. This is the Maumee River that goes to Lake Erie and the North Atlantic. This is the Little River that goes to the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico. So it's a very subtle but important continental divide, and he's right there in the middle of it. So the U.S. promised to build him a 2-story home in 1826, now known as the Richardville House, or Pinjuwa-Wiki. Pinjuwa, or Richardville, pictured here, bequeathed this reserve to his daughter, a woman named LeBlond. In turn, LeBlond lived in the house, and she also wrote a will, bequeathing this reserve land to her son and daughter. George and Archange, the son and daughter, are 2 of the many grandchildren of Jean-Baptiste. They in turn split their lands equally. This is actually a picture of Archange Richardville and her husband, James R. Godfroy, also a Miami person. But the sibling, George Awesome, he died intestate. He died relatively young, and the land was then split between Archange Magunzagwa here and a guy named William Cass, who's named Michiganakwa. Now, without going into each division, by 1870, Archange, the owner of much of the reserve, divided her estate among her children. So Archange remained in the big house. Mary Godfroy married a German immigrant, a guy named Charles Strack, and they had 7 children who survived to adulthood. So Mary and the Stracks are living in this home on the north side of the reserve. So we're left with George's question in the beginning. What happened? Why was I born in Shikakonge? By the 1890s, Mary Strack's children were adults. Several married and many didn't. Several didn't. They were living by the 1870s, 80s, 90s on this land, just south of the county poor farm, adjacent to the Bluffton Toll Road. So why move to Chicago? I'll leave a lot of the complicated answer to my colleague who will come back up here and hopefully explain that. But I have a lot of lingering questions. It's not solved. What I can say is that the county recorder's office is a snapshot of land sales, and that's kind of what I'm looking at. Many of the Stracks and their relatives filed suits to clarify or recover their land, including winning some in the Indiana Supreme Court. They claimed fraud. They had dubious guardianships that relinquished some of their land as legal minors. This is what it looks like to find Miami needles in the haystack of a county's property market. This is the one case. But it does appear that over the course of several years in the 1890s, each of the 7 heirs of Mary Strack sold their undivided 1/7 interest in the land to one Oliver S. Hanna, who was a well-known figure at that time in Kikeonge in Fort Wayne. Each sale was between $450 and $500. There are many aspects of what you'll hear next that I really can't account for in the land records, including people continuing to live on the land even though they sold it. Are they squatters? Did they recover the land through some suit? To find that story, you have to go to a different archive and a different bureaucracy. It's the court archive, not the land archive. So it's all in different places. It's all disparate. It's all abstract. That's the human side. It's even messier than the messy paper trail. So I guess the next question, George, is why is mapping important to Miamia folks? Why is this explanation of land ownership at all significant in the story that you told?
Newenika. Owen achko kilendange. Niluna achko kilendamange. Nila achko kilendamane. Nila miamia metosenia. Meme shikewenzwane. Sa kachakwa, tahkamwa, penjewa. Nehe planazwa la picasiane. Nimeshuma cha chawens bitche. Usa la kikandanga. Nimeshumahe. Penalawache nia tekakwe na mewa si piwe. Mayakwe cheshiki kayongonje. Elisha nusa penalache nehenila pena sheche shikakonge. Kitwenje. Na peshe shitehiane ne pa chekikate ta ne jike kapi shamenge nehe etawe cheke miamyonge cheke miamyake. Nipa cheke kate, ke twainje wi samyamyake ma cheke, ma cha cheke, myamyongonje. Nu jonge sipyongonje, wa pangya kamyongonje, nehe wa pa sheke sipyongonje. Who cares for this history? Well, we care. I care. Right? I am a Miamia person and a citizen of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma. And I come from these families, from the Richardville and Godfrey families. My grandfather and my great-grandfather were born close to the Namewasipiwe, the St. Mary's River, southwest of Kikayonge, on these lands. Kikayonge, the site of the grandest village of Miamia people, our historic capital city. But my father and I were born here in Shikakonge. As Miamia people, I think we can ask the question, why? There's other ancestries we have, right? Separate questions to ask. Today I'm focusing on the questions we ask as Miamia people. Most Miamia people want to understand how our lands were divided and sold away from us, but also, as we're learning, how we kept some lands and what we did with what we kept. They too want to better understand why so many Miamia people left our lands in what is today Oklahoma, Kansas, and Indiana. Why are we living in 49 states internationally and not in all 3 or one of these deeply Miamia places? Sa Kachakwa, Mary Frances Godfrey Strack, here on the right, as Cam said, had 7 children born between 1860 and 1876, 7 who survived to adulthood. At least one set of twins died in infancy. Sa Kachakwa and her German husband Charles' children, from oldest to youngest, were Aacimwahkionkonci, confusingly also Mary Frances. My family has a bad habit of just repeating English names. The Miamia names are always different. We never name people generation to generation after each other, but the English and French names, we as the third George in my family, it gets quite confusing sometimes. Kile Kamekwa, Dick Kielsunza came after Aacimwahkionkonci. Kielsunza Pat came after Dick. Mangunzikwa Elizabeth was next. Awanzapia James, who we already introduced to. And my great-grandfather, Kikandanga Charles. And lastly, the youngest of the family, Achikunza, or Florentine. The family lived together, as Cam said, on the portion of the 160 acres of the reserve divided for them. You can see here Aacimwahkionkonci, Mary Frances, the daughter, and Mangunzikwa Standing, and her husband, Jesse McLaren, who you'll learn more about in a minute. They lived in this reserve and inherited upon the death of Sakachakwa. As Cam demonstrated using the series of maps, the Richardville Reserve was actively divided by the entire family, possibly in order to meet the economic needs as the family grew in size. This is classic fractionization for those who study allotment in the West. This is classically how allotments lose their financial value, is that the next generations divide them up and then they can't sustain themselves on them, and the land is sold and then is removed from tribal control. As Kim already said, following the death of Sakachakwa, the children each inherited an undivided 1/7 interest, or about 23 acres in value, in their portion of the reserve. By comparison, Miamialatis on the Miami Indian Reservation in Indian Territory, what would become Oklahoma, received 200 acres each when that reservation was allotted in 1891. Shortly after the death of Sakachakwa, Mary Frances, the older, the family was forced to defend the status of the reserve as, quote, Indian land in court in Indiana. Beginning at some point after 1871, the Richardville Reserve lands had been illegally taxed by Allen County officials. In 1879, a man named Charles Aldrich purchased the Strack Reserve at a tax auction. The oldest of my great-grandfather's siblings, Wapimangwa, again here on the left, Mary Frances, was the lead plaintiff in the family's lawsuit. Eventually, her case worked its way to the 7th Circuit of the Federal District Court in Indiana. In his ruling on the case, Judge William Woods asserted that as Indian lands under the terms of the 1787 Northwest Ordinance, the Richardville Reserve was not subject to taxation. In his ruling, Woods determined that the lands had been perpetually in the control of descendants of Pinjua, Jean-Baptiste Richardville, and that Wapimangwa, Mary Frances Strack, and her siblings had maintained their tribal relations, still spoke the Miamia language, and were not considered citizens of the United States. The tax sale was then ruled invalid, and legal ownership of the reserve was recognized as resting with Wapimangwa and her 6 siblings. The family had survived a major challenge to their legal rights, and as individual Indians residing within the state of Indiana. But the struggle would continue to be an uphill one in the years that followed the ruling in Wapimangwa v. Aldrich. So to make this really clear, their tribal nation was existing in the West, in what it became Kansas and then Oklahoma. So they had no tribal government to turn to. They were individual Indians with treaty rights living in the state of Indiana, but they didn't have the apparatus of a tribal government to protect them. They could, but they would have had to move to either Kansas or Indian Territory to access that apparatus. They couldn't protect them in an umbrella fashion back in the ceded lands post-removal. In the 1890s, my family tried various strategies to survive within the prevailing economic system and provide for their growing family. They farmed the land, growing minjipe, maize corn, as their ancestors had since before European arrival. In the winter, they also harvested ice from the Namewa Sipiwe, the St. Mary's River, for sale and for use in their own operations. Most significantly, Kikandanga, Charles, opened a saloon together with Jesse McLaren, the husband of his older sister, Magunzikwa Elizabeth. So Charles and Jesse are pictured in the doorway here as much younger men than the earlier photo that you saw of Jesse. To the right of the doorway is Charles Strack the German, who married into the family. And then the 3 daughters are on the left. Florentine, standing, is Elizabeth, and seated is Mary Frances, or Wapimangwa. And then the 2 children, which is how we're able to date this photo, are the children of Elizabeth and Jesse McLaren. And this photo comes to us, big missionewe, to our cousin Lou Fox, who's a descendant of Elizabeth and Jesse McLaren. We don't know when this saloon opened, likely in the 1880s, but it had a grand reopening, which was well covered in the newspapers, following a renovation in 1894. Formerly, the saloon was called the Richardville Valley Sample Room, but it was often referred to in the papers as Strack and McLaren's Saloon. The saloon served beer from the Berghoff Brewery, which you can see the sign over the door, Herman Berghoff Beer. For those of you that know Chicago pretty well, you might be familiar with that company. which that brewery got its start in Kihkayonge in Fort Wayne before relocating here to Shikakonge after a successful run in a beer tent at the World's Columbian Exposition, right, the Great White City. My family's saloon was often covered in the newspapers in Kihkayonge, Fort Wayne, in large part because Jesse was violently abusive, and this put him into regular conflict with all of the Strack siblings. The most dramatic example of this long-running conflict was reported on in detail by the Fort Wayne News on April 5th, 1895. The article, titled "Hot Race War," describes a brawl at the family saloon between the Strack and McLaren families. The violence was the result of attempts to exclude Jesse from the business due to his ongoing abuse of Mangunzikwa, Elizabeth. The article describes my family as, quote, having their war paint on, and the women of the family as, quote, copper-colored Amazons. There are no direct quotes from any member of the Strack family in the article, but near the end, the paper quotes extensively from Jesse McLaren, who asserted that, quote, unless the saloon is closed up immediately, and the Indians will get on a howling drunk by confiscating all the liquors, and that the river dances will terminate in murder. According to McLaren, quote, no Indian can run a saloon under the law. What he's referring to here is a state law in Indiana that Indians may not run businesses without a white male supervising the running of the business. As a legal minor, they couldn't be independent as business operators. So he's saying without his presence, the bar is illegal. Without his presence, he claimed, no one will be able to stop, quote, the Indians from continuing their drunken revelry and running the saloon like a riot, end quote. McLaren concluded by adding that, quote, a race war between the whites who have married into the Indian families out there seems to be impending, and my life is not safe a minute in that neighborhood, end quote. The race war episode highlights the challenges our family faced in maintaining a business in oppressively racist circumstances. I want to be very clear here, I don't take Jesse at his word at all. He brought his family in to try and force his way back in the door as an operator of a saloon, and the Strack siblings tried to force him out. I see him playing off stereotypes that are well known in this period and before of Indians and liquor, and his attempt to use those stereotypes to his advantage in terms of controlling the business. Not that certainly they didn't drink sometimes, but I don't think that was the actual source of the problem here. By the time my grandfather was born in 1905, the fortunes of the family had declined extremely, and a relocation, at least for a part of the family, was in progress. As already described, Aacimwahkionkonci, James, moved to Shikakonge, Chicago in 1893 to work in the Berghoff's beer tent on the Midway Plaisance at the World's Columbian Exposition. As we saw in the opening story, he then went on to open his own saloon, the Corn Palace, and 10 Bar, the White Palace Saloon, Burger's Saloon, and the Berghoff Cafe. Later in his life, he went on to become a railroad bull, and he worked security on the railroads here in Chicago. My grandfather George and his siblings were separated from their father sometime shortly after the death of their mother, Maud Amen, a German immigrant, in 1908. Some of the children were sent to an orphanage in Lafayette, Indiana, and others, like my grandfather, went to live with their relatives. Nemeshuma, my grandfather, moved to Chicago to live with his uncle, Aacimwahkionkonci, James. This is my grandfather on the left, and his next oldest sister, Violet. And then this is likely the home that the Stracks were living with around the time things were kind of coming to an end on the reserve. In previous generations, under the Miamia kinship system, children would have referred to all their father's brothers as Nusa, or what we could translate as my father in English. It's not an exact translation. And they referred to all their mother's sisters as Inga, or mother. Aacimwahkionkonci, James, certainly treated my grandfather as a close younger relative, perhaps like a son. But we're fairly certain that my grandfather did not speak the Miamia language and referred to Aacimwahkionkonci as Uncle Jim. The fragmentation of the Miamia community that was set into motion with the 1846 removal that Cam talked about, the 1846 removal of the Miami Nation to what became Kansas, these removals created ripple effects that put our language on a path to silence. My great-grandparents' generation, Kikandanga Charles and others, they all spoke Miamia Atawenge as children, likely as their first language. At the time of the trial in the late 1880s, they were still listed as speaking the language as one of the key signs that they hadn't relinquished their tribal relations. But by the time of my grandfather's birth in 1905, the language was no longer being passed on to the children in our family. This choice, in quotes, was a product of cultural and economic oppression. We have lots of research and examples of this in the community. This pattern was repeated across Myaamyonge Miami lands in this same time period. So as a contrast, the two little children in the saloon photo, they were taught a limited vocabulary of Myaamya words. They were just slightly older than my grandfather. By the time my grandfather is born, there's not even a little bit of vocabulary being taught. Here's a shot of the family near another home on the reserve around the time of Maud Eamon's death. And it's my grandfather's older brother John in the middle and his oldest brother Charlie, who you'll see in a photo at the very end as an adult in this photo. My great-grandfather, Kikandanga Charles, remarried in 1913 to a German immigrant named Charlotte Brunn. Family stories tell us that she virulently disliked the children, and on at least one occasion tried to seriously harm them. The family never appears to have fully reunited to live together in one place again. The 1920 census shows that two of the children, my grandfather and his sister Violet, were living with Kikandanga, Charles, and Charlotte in the 2000 block of Karlov in what is today the Hermosa neighborhood, but the rest of the children never joined them, the best we can tell. In the 1920s, Awanzapia James, Kikandanga Charles, my grandfather George and his brother John all became involved as extras in movies or shorts that were filmed in Shikakonge and its surrounds. These movies were possibly filmed by SNA Studios, which some of you may be aware of if you're from Chicago, which was located on Argyle in Uptown. My family has a collection of photos, again thanks to Lou Fox and others, of my grandfather posing in the background of either his uncle or his father's apartment in Shikakonge, Chicago. A classic kind of backyard of a three-flat here in the city. It's difficult to know for sure, but these photos could have been taken on Karlov. They could have been taken on Karlov, the 4700 block of North Sawyer, or 100 block of South Laughlin Street, all places that the censuses show the family living at various points. And of course, they could be in other places. These photos highlight another common economic pursuit that Myaamya people engaged in during this period of time, and this occurs all over Indiana, and here is an example in Illinois, where Myaamya people played Indian for white audiences. But for my family, they also show something precious. My grandfather and his brother John interacting in a really positive way with their father in Shikakonge after a period of difficult separation. Thus far, the Aacimwahkionkonci team has created some powerful answers to the question, what happened to the Miami Nation's land? But our work has, unsurprisingly, created many new questions. Foremost among these is how do we connect the legal and abstract history of the land, which has this hidden violence that we're talking about? How do we reconnect that abstract legal history with the people who belong to that land, who continue to belong to that land, despite being distanced from it? This presentation is an attempt at one response to that question. This work has left me certain of a few things. The land remains, for the most part, there's exceptions. The changes in legal title, court rulings, and deeds do not necessarily alienate us from the land if we work to reconnect or maintain existing connections. Not everything's become frayed, not everything's gone silent. For my family specifically, the Aacimwahkionkonci, the Chief Richardville house, the big brick house, it remains, it has survived. The family home, a very powerful symbol of family home, remains, but the family is dispersed. Charles Strack, my grandfather's brother, formed a new healthy family elsewhere in the Kikayonga area, and his grandchildren are active in the Miami Nation today. So it's Charles, now grown up as an adult on crutches here in this photo. And you can see Awanzapia James on the far left, This is near the end of his life. He came to live with Charles for a while and then went back to Chicago shortly before he died, before he passed away. My grandfather, this is my grandfather's brother, my grandfather, George J. Strack Sr., formed a healthy family here in Aacimwahkionkonci, and his children and grandchildren are active in the Miami Nation. There's a picture of Nusa and Nzeko Sasu, who are both here today, and Nishima Akawita, my brother Matt, in between the two of them, and me just leaning in and photobombing their photo. But all the legacies are not positive, right? I really want to emphasize resiliency and strength, but I don't want to paint that as the only result. My great-grandfather's brother, Kilsunza, Pat Strack, was unable to find stability following the loss of the reserve, but he remained unwilling to leave, perceived as a squatter on his family's land, living in, I think, what could be fairly called a shack on the bank of the Namewa Sipiwe.
So there's stories of hope and optimism, as well as some bleak prospects for an obviously violent process. I want to thank certainly the real and financial support of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma, who's been a supporter of this work for many years, which it has taken, certainly not done, as well as a 3-year National Endowment for the Humanities grant that has just ended. So thanks to many of the team members. I'll highlight the mapping team that helps us so much. I'm just a historian. I'm not a cartographer. So McKenna and Maboob, and particularly Robin Abbott of the mapping team and the GIS team have helped us a great deal. I'm interested in some wrapping up here, which is like, okay, what do we take away from Aacimwahkionkonci in this room? One of the ideas that I had while George was talking was many of us heard of Keith Basso, Western Apache, Wisdom Sits in Places. That's the title of his book, which suggests the argument of the book, which is Wisdom Sits in Places. Well, for Miami people, I've heard George and others say that stories sit in places. So what happens when all the people move away from those story places? What happens to the language, the connections? And so this is a virtual way, the tool at least is a virtual way of reconnecting people with those ancestral places. Nonetheless, it remains virtual. So there are real limits to looking at a map and beating Miamia on that place. I don't think they're the same thing. I don't know if George has anything to say about this particular place.
Yeah, so this is Aacimwahkionkonci, the Richardville house, which you saw historic photos of. And I think to the point made earlier about surveying, we want to end pictures in full color, right? Living, vibrant Miamia people, especially our youth. And my cousin Danny Tipman, who descends from Charles L. Strack, is a regular interpreter and tour guide at this house, as well as her children are. And so we have a hand in interpreting, our family has a hand in interpreting our own history in the Fort Wayne area. And when we have youth camps in the Fort Wayne area in the past, we've been able to take groups of our youth who are learning language and culture in a community setting to places like Aacimwahkionkonci and to hear the story of these places from our perspective, right? So the goal of Aacimwahkionkonci is to create a gateway through which people can connect to places and each other, but then the necessary next step is to actually visit some of those places in person. Maybe not all of them, but certainly some of them to connect in the really real IRL. The children here give me a lot of hope. My own children have visited this place regularly, and they understand it as a historic family home and a place marker of deep time in the Kikayonge area. So I think, right, as Cam said, for us, stories sit in places. And if we can reconnect or revitalize, because some of these stories are maintained in families, they haven't been lost, revitalize the stories as they sit within families, then the land isn't really lost, no matter who holds the title to it. Right? Miamionge is still there waiting for us. Again, there are exceptions to this, but I've found that many of these places we can reconnect with regardless of legal title. But not to say legal title doesn't matter. So before COVID, a landowner in the Fort Wayne area named Brian Johnson, a non-Miami person, a settler descendant, he gave to the Miami tribe of Oklahoma his family's parcel of land that sits within our family's historic reserve. It's across the street from this house, back behind a roller derby dome. It's not developable land, but it's a really beautiful parcel. And now, as a community, we own a piece of that reserve again, and that certainly does have meaning. So, if you've heard of land back, it's actually real. It does happen. People do give the Miami tribe land back. And I think just lastly, I'll add that my grandfather's interactions in Chicago didn't sort of end with his work in the movies. I have a lot of questions about that. There aren't a lot of stories in our family about what that participation was like for him. But he went on to participate here in the Indian Council Fire Organization. The records of that organization are housed, or a large number of them are housed here at the Newberry. And he also doggedly pursued our family's claims under the Indian Claims Commission, which was a really important process. Obviously, there's a financial motivation, but it's also a really important legal connection that has to be maintained. You have to exert your rights under the current legal order we live under, and if you don't, they can be assumed to have been relinquished, right? So we see in our family's history as a constant effort to assert legal rights so that they're not assumed to be relinquished. I think that's it from us.
I'll ask the three speakers to take the seats up at the stage here, these luxe accommodations. And it strikes me just as we're preparing that what George just ended, the need to reaffirm and constantly reinstate and act proactively in order to maintain status and claims is exactly what Jennifer was talking about in her paper as well. I'll turn things over to Will, who will handle the questions. We have about 20 minutes or so for conversation before we take a break, and we'll be back on time then.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you from me as well to the three speakers. Those were really powerful and fascinating talks. So we already have a bunch of questions queued up, so I was hoping I would have time for one of my own, but it's okay, we're gonna dive right in. So the earliest question that came in is from Karen Barsman, and she is asking to Jennifer, could you tell us the size of the Ayer map of Teotihuacan? How would it have been handled and or exhibited in a space of legal adjudication? I'm gonna let you answer that, and then there's another one after that.
Thank you. That's an excellent question, and I feel bad for the person asking it if they're not in this audience, because I'm going to go like this. I don't actually know the exact dimension. I don't have them memorized, but I've seen it in person.
It's big.
And it's mounted, and I've looked at it here in the Newberry Library. It's behind a glass case. But this question about how it would have been looked at is an excellent question, because these community documents were often placed. It's thought that they were placed on a table and that perhaps the community would be gathered around them. So some maps have changing orientations, like the figures might be. They're placed according to how the person on the particular side of that map would have been viewing them. And so they become very interesting visually to look at. And then, as I mentioned in the talk, the documents themselves are meant to be kind of expounded upon. So often I think they were intended to be looked at by a number of people, not by like a single person, but by a group. And I'm not sure how they would have been stored, but this particular example, it seems like it was folded just based on the destruction that you can see along the lines of its folding. So thank you.
So a sort of follow-up on that will combine two of the questions that have been asked. One person is asking about, there obviously were European papers available by 1560. Why did they choose Amate for the map, if you know? And speaking of it a little more broadly in terms of its indigenous production, the material used for its support? Is it on paper, locally made, indigenously made? And what of the use of lines? Is that involve a ruler for the boundaries? Is that part of an indigenous tradition of representation, or is that strictly European? So those kinds of questions about the production and the paper itself.
Again, excellent question. So mate is a pre-colonial indigenous tradition of making paper. It's a fig-based bark. And I've actually visited communities where they still make paper in this way today. And they, in a particular community I visited, they take the bark of the tree and they peel it off with a big machete, and then they boil it for hours until it becomes a soft pulp, and then you take it out and pound it into the paper. And so that's why it has that really thick, kind of fibrous texture that you can see. And then it's dried in the sun. So I think that it's part of the tradition. I think it's part of cultural tradition, but I think in the later colonial period, it's also part of this conscious archaizing of the map itself to make it look like it's specifically a Nawa land title and not a European one. And then in terms of cost of material and availability of material, I don't think that European paper would have been widely available to indigenous communities. I think European paper was really expensive to procure for importation reasons, and I don't think that they would have been able to get paper that was that large in size either. I'm totally speculating on that. As an art historian, that's what I would say.
I can also just chime in and say that we have 18th century examples of amate being used in this same way in the Newberry's collection as well. So it definitely continues to be used as a sort of archaizing form, as an aside. One more for Jennifer, and then we'll have questions, I think, for everybody. This question is, I don't know who it's from, but they say they really appreciated your discussion of how this map both documented performances of ritualized boundary walking and was further activated through embodied participatory reading and interpretation. Given what you said about the map being a living document, do you have reason to believe that it provided evidence for differing interpretations over time, or was it consistent in resolving land disputes? Let's stop there.
That's an excellent question. So the maps vary in the placement of the figures and the boundaries from example to example. And so I've had to kind of check and recheck the way I was presenting the information depending on the example I was talking about. So I do think that things were manipulated or just might have changed over time depending on whoever was making the map, whatever the particular case was that it was brought out and consulted. So yeah, these are really excellent questions. Thank you.
Something somewhat related, and you might just give the same answer, but this person's also asking about dancing as something that has also been employed as evidence for indigenous land claims. Do you have a sense of ritualized practices beyond boundary walking that might be triggered by or embedded in this cartographic representation?
And not in this particular example, but in other Nawa examples, there are clear, some of the perimeters of the maps are these boundaries that are walked, and so the place names are like kind of the boundaries of that community. This map is more of a cross, I'd say, between European pictorial conventions and the indigenous footprints. But in other maps, I'd say the boundary is the kind of boundary. The community is located centrally in the map. That's what I'm trying to say. And then the boundary that has been marked matches the periphery of the page that it's placed on. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So this question is for all three speakers from Seth. The grids in the maps of your talks speak to the legacy of everything from the Merced system to the Dawes Act. In what ways do you see, if any, do you see your grids contesting or affirming the role of capitalism in shaping the division and representation of land, as our last two speakers' talks so compellingly suggested? Whoever wants to start.
That's a great question. Yeah, really interesting. The commodification of Miamia land and pulling it into the American domain is what these surveyors are doing. That's the project of surveying, and it's an interesting. We think a lot, I guess, in Native American indigenous studies about like what is activism and what is fighting against and what is, and I wonder about Jean-Baptiste Richardville talking to surveyors and saying, no, I want that land, survey it that way, angle it this way. You can see these things from space, or maybe 10,000 feet, because if a tree line is going like this, that's a Miami person who put it that way before the surveyors had the north and south lines. The treaties are saying, there are many that say cranberry bog. So like Johnny's Cranberry Bog is many of these reserves, or salt mines, or things like that. So key resources that are being retained. So in terms of resource and capitalism, I'm kind of toying with the idea, because I don't think about capitalism actually that much. But what do you think, George? Is it a transition towards capitalism? Might be another.
Yeah. Yep. This one left too. Yeah. Really, really good question. Thank you, Seth. And just playing off Cam's response, certainly it's Miami people interacting with capitalism, but that's not new for Pinjua. His father was a French fur trader. His mother was a Miami fur trader. He had grown up within a certain kind of capitalism of the northward-orientated fur trade and become quite masterful at it. He was a businessman, a successful one, and recognized as a powerful leader in his community because of his access to those business connections. So certainly capitalism is, as has already been said, it's a changing system, and Miami people in one way or another have been integrated with it since contact with Europeans. But I think the thing to stress with land that was eye-opening for me when we first started investigating the creation of these individual family and collective national reserve lands through the treaty process beginning in 1818 is how this was a form of resistance. And so I've taken to calling it adaptive resistance, borrowing the language of the anthropologist Ben Segunda, he's written about the Pokagon-Vana Potawatomi, and that adaptive resistance varies from militant resistance in that you're sacrificing certain parts of who you are, you're changing certain things like economic system practices in order to maintain your community and stay where you are. And that in many cases, they had successfully developed a system whereby through treaty payments and the maintenance of certain key parts of land, they could have survived and thrived in Indiana. The problem is the people with power kept changing the rules, and they couldn't adapt to a legal system that simply would not, most times, recognize their legal power. The Wapiamangwa v. Aldrich case stands out as significant because it's a rare case in the late 1800s that a Miami person wins a legal taxation trial. There's one other case where a family wins, but most of the other cases, people lose their land as a result. So the legal system that develops enforces a racialized capitalism, right? That excludes indigenous people and, of course, African Americans as well in this period.
And there's another obvious point that I think is worth making here, which important point, that underlying most of 19th century and early 20th century American Indian policy is forcing Native Americans to become capitalists. That is the goal. Private property, farming, really private property. That is the Dawes Act, which was referenced in the question. So if we can push Native people to become capitalists, they will cease to exist as Native people. And that's the goal from the U.S. government's point of view.
I'm so glad that Seth asked this question particularly about Teotihuacan, because I was thinking about this morning, but this is a pre-Hispanic city that was planned on a grid system. And I always like to bring this up with my students because I think generally speaking, the grid system is interpreted as a Western European invention and then convention that gets put over. But Teotihuacan was planned on a grid, independent of European contact. Now, how that transitions into the colonial period, I'm not as sure. What's interesting about the question about capitalism, and I think early environmental historians of central Mexico have talked about this, how this encomienda system is actually born more out of feudalistic Spanish land policy, this idea that overlords are granted entitlements of labor and tracts of land, and indigenous people work for them and they work that land. So I am not as well-versed in kind of the history of capitalism, but I I think ultimately, I think what's interesting about this particular case is that it seems that the indigenous landowners hold on to their rights throughout the duration of the colonial period until the lands get expropriated by the Porfirian government in the late 1800s, and it gets turned into a national archaeological site. So there's just, yeah, these really kind of interesting moments throughout the history. It's a great question.
All right, thank you all. Another question for all of you. Don't have a name for this one, but that's okay. What do you make of the places and times when maps are not produced in the histories that you're tracing? There are a lot of points and places of dispute and creation of boundaries in both stories, but really only one map that shows up between you. What can this absence tell us about performance of mapping?
I'll start. So Cam was clear to mention an outstanding piece of land that the Miami tribe of Oklahoma, the Miami Nation, recognizes as unceded. It's within in Illinois. And in the Indian Claims Commission process, the government drew on a series of maps to inform them as what lands tribes had a right to claim through the Indian claims process, and started in the mid 1900s. And the tribes were dependent on these maps that had been pre-drawn. And that parcel of land was not drawn to in any way connect to Miamia people, which then restricted the tribe's ability to put a claim in at that time. Right? So there's an absence of mapping. That through revitalization of knowledge, our own internal historical work, as well as hiring outside experts to research this period of time, we were able to identify that no, in fact, there is a legitimate legal claim to this land that now has to work its way through a process whereby we have to get permission to sue the United States government because the Claims Commission process is closed. So this is one very real example of silences in the mapping and their economic and political consequences for us today as a people.
Just to clarify, so the question is about how we know that there was a mapping tradition prior to colonial contact, is that?
So the question is about if there are places and times where we don't have maps in the historical record, or at least we don't have maps of exactly what we would want in the historical record. What do you make of those, and what can those absences, if they exist, tell us about the performance of mapping?
So I would say it does get kind of debated a lot for Mesoamerican cartography if there is a pre-colonial, pre-contact, such a thing as a cartographic tradition, because so many indigenous documents and codices were destroyed upon Spanish arrival to New Spain, but we do have, very famously Cortez and Bernal Diaz de Castillo and these early Spanish conquistadors write in their accounts of indigenous informants creating maps for them and helping them along their journeys. And then there's also evidence of kind of diagrams of the cosmos or cosmograms, so this kind of spatialization of the universe as it correlates with the ritual calendar and that sort of thing. So those are some of the extant examples that we have.
Okay, thank you all. I think that's the last question we have queued up. The number to text your questions to is on the screen, but I'll say it as well, 833-899-3399. I think we still have at least 5 minutes if anybody wants to text in another question. But I will take the moderator's prerogative at this point and ask one of the questions that I wanted to ask. I really loved the resonances between all of your talks in the ways that they thought about generations using these maps again and again, over and over, and in the ways that language played into that. The Nawa language, the Miamia language, and how those play into the maps that are being produced today. And were produced in the 16th century in the case of Jennifer's talk. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about the sort of future-looking aspect of performance in both of these maps, how ownership plays into that, and how the languages used play into that. That's a very broad question, but take it in any direction you want.
I'm sure I'll be the least pithy, so I'll start.
as a language learner and someone interested in supporting revitalization of Miami cultural practices and knowledge, one way to think about the place of Miami people, which is very important, Miami-onge, the place that Miami people live, work, play, and have for a very long time. One way to consider that is not through Little Turtle's explanation of here are boundaries, but rather here are the places that we have names for, and the names suggest what we do at those places, in some cases. So the Namewas Sipiwi, the St. Mary's River, where the Richardville Reserve is this, I think it's fair to talk about this? Okay, the Sturgeon River, where sturgeon would visit and spawn all the way from, now they're reintroducing the sturgeon into Lake Erie and some of the Great Lakes, these massive alligator-like things. So there's language embedded in, there's information in the language about the land and what it should be used for, can be used for, in all kinds of ways. And so thinking about where the Miamis live, you could just map all the places that the Miamis have named, is a different way of thinking about the territory of Miami people.
Yeah, and I just add to that, I think, building off of Keith Basso's Wisdom Sits in Places, he demonstrates how, like, the Western Apache travel landscape, and when they encounter a place, they then tell a story about it. And, that's how, many of these things operated for most indigenous people, including Miamia people. And so through Aacimwahkionkonci, we want to create like the network for teaching and learning, but then the end result is going to these places and telling the stories. And so here's where language revitalization and cultural revitalization merge with geographic revitalization through Aacimwahkionkonci, that for a while, 1960s to the 1990s, our language wasn't spoken. It is now spoken again, and one of the major accomplishments in that praxis of speaking language again is revitalizing storytelling in our language, so we can tell stories again completely in Miamiatawenge, and many in the audience can understand the story. Oftentimes we do storytelling in rooms like this, right? But the places those stories really live, as we said multiple times, is often in the land. And so taking the people to the place and telling the story in that place, to me, is like the next future step for community revitalization, thinking as an educator and as a storyteller in my community.
Yeah, and I would just like to add, I absolutely agree with what you both said. I think that the next kind of looking forward for those involved in NAWA studies is language revitalization, but also responsibility for non-Native scholars like myself to bolster and support Native NAWA speakers and Native NAWA scholars to reconnect and be stewards of these documents to their own communities.
That's great. And we are exactly at 2:45. So I guess we should wrap up. Thank you all.
Thanks, Will, for leading a really stimulating conversation. Thanks all for working with the time, and we are back on time. This never happens. And we have 15 minutes to take a break. We'll reconvene at 3 o'clock.